It's an extremely paternalistic view of Africa, clearly, and clearly an expansion of a kind of Monroe Doctrine-esque thinking, where as they did in 1823, was saying, no, we're protecting Latin America from the imperialism of the West, but in fact, it was an opportunity to expand the U.S. empire and build the U.S. empire, and we kind of feel like there's this similar approach.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. The US and Europe have tried to make Africa a battleground in their Cold War against Russia and China. They've even labeled Africa as NATO's southern neighborhood and are using AFRICOM as a mechanism to control the continent under the guise of protecting it from malign Chinese and Russian influence. What does this mean for sovereignty and independence across Africa? And how are African countries pushing back? To help break it all down, I'm joined by Mikaela Nhondo Erskog, a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and a member of No Cold War and the Dongsheng News Collective. But before we jump into it, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can help it grow by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthroughnews or by donating below on YouTube. Miko, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me again. It's always a pleasure.
So, I mean, interestingly enough, as we were talking before, you are coming to me from South Africa, and I'm in Lebanon right now, so we're both dealing with our own electricity issues. So I'm glad that we could find a time where we both had electricity to do this interview. But that said, I guess let's just jump right into it. Obviously, the reason I asked you on is because of this No Cold War that was also published by the Tricontinental Institute, sort of briefing on Africa as a battleground in the new Cold War, at least the US trying to make Africa as a battleground in its Cold War with both China and Russia. So a good place to start out, I think, would be, something that's mentioned in that briefing is that something very important that took place back in August, which is that the Biden administration outlined this new Africa strategy. They released this 17-page document that was supposed to be about U.S. Africa strategy, but actually, as mentioned in the No Cold War report, mentions China and Russia 10 times, which is quite a bit for just a 17-page document that's supposed to be about Africa. And it goes on to talk about African sovereign, or no, it doesn't talk about African sovereignty, actually. The opposite, it talks about U.S. interests in Africa and claims that we're not going to dictate the choice, Africa's choices for it. That said, we have to make sure that Russia and China don't have malign influence in Africa. So could you start out by maybe telling us what was the significance of this new Africa strategy by the White House? Why does it matter? And how does it factor into the U.S. Cold War with China and Russia?
Sure thing. I mean, as you mentioned, I think the biggest red flag or red flags that a lot of African leaders, policymakers, people who are interested in these questions were identifying was we're at a stage now in Africa where defending our sovereignty, advancing our sovereignty, whether it's through the form of, social development, economic development, etc. So sovereignty to us is a major concern on the continent. And yet in this, we don't see, as you said, any mention of sovereignty. We kind of see, the usual hollow, empty promises of we're going to help you advance, we're going to help you prioritize your interests. But clearly, as you said, there's this excessive mention of China and Russia. And not only is it just a mention, it's a specific characterization. And I can read a few of the quotes. I mean, when they talk about China and Russia and other foreign actors, they're pledging to counter harmful activities is the way they frame it. And they say, when they're talking specifically about China, they see it as an important, China and Africa, or China sees Africa as an important region where, and this is their words, to challenge the rule-based order, the rules-based international order advance its own narrow commercial interests and geopolitical interests and undermine transparency and openness. And how they talk about how this will weaken US relations with Africa. And then they also have a part where they talk about, which is very much in line with the National Defense Strategy of 2022, is that they talk about how they're going to partner with Africans to expose and highlight the risks of negative PRC, that's China and Russian activities on the continent. So there's this clear like zoning into China and Russia that kind of undermines what would be seen as independent or aspirations towards independent relationships that will be based on African realities and the pressing issues that African people are facing. And I mean, of course, we are in a moment where thankfully a lot of African leaders have spoken out about this. You know, when Naledi Pandor, the foreign minister of South Africa, when she was in the meeting with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, she did say, you know, blatantly that we hate being told it's an either or. We hate being bullied, and she has characterized it as patronizing bullying from NATO member states to take a side with the US in terms of the Ukraine war. And this is despite Blinken's, you know, kind of hollow attempts at saying, we don't want you guys to choose. We don't want you guys to choose, but watch out for China and Russia. And so it's concerning that that's the starting point for US engagement. It's not surprising. It's not surprising because this dates back to, you know, several decades. I mean,
Right.
if we go back to 2010, or no, 2001 even, but the early 2000s, we see in US military defense documents this acknowledgement of China and Russia posing a threat, specifically China, of course, because in the last 2 decades, China's increased their commercial, political, and various other cooperations and relationships with the African continent. I mean, just last year, we saw a almost 35% increase in the trade between Africa and China. Now it's around 254 billion, which, just for context though, is, I think Africa is maybe the sixth region in China's kind of total trade volume proportionately. So it's first with Asia, then Europe, North America, Latin America. I mean, we're even behind Oceania. I think we're like about 3.3% of China's global trade volume. So I mean, even though there are significant commercial interests, much larger than the US's, it still doesn't necessarily justify what they would see even as economic competitive terms, right? Because it's a relatively small proportion of specifically China's total global trade.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's interesting the timing of all this, right? Because I mean, it probably would have happened anyways with the strategy of, you know, you have to counter Chinese and Russian malign influence, but then you have the issue of the war in Ukraine like hanging over all of this. And throughout this year, I think that it was a pretty big wake up call for the US to see so much of the global south, you know, not necessarily taking Russia's side, but really just not wanting to take a side and demonstrating the importance of Russia as a place that a lot of countries not only want to trade with, but need to trade with because it's this like commodities powerhouse, much like China in many ways. Um, and so there does seem to be this like serious insecurity coming from the US and the European countries about the fact that throughout this war, only like a couple African countries have even signed on to condemnations of Russia or even, should I say, the sanctions of Russia, right? Like all these countries, not only do they not want to join in on the Western sanctions on Russia, they can't because they need Russia for fertilizer and grain and energy. And I mean, I think that it really reached its peak in August, you know, when the rollout of this document came out, when the US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, traveled to a bunch of African countries, including Ghana, Uganda, Cape Verde. And I want to quote her. She said, "We're not asking Africans to make any choices between the US and Russia. For me, that choice would be simple. That choice is nonetheless." And then the funny thing about that is she's saying like she went there and said that, but then kind of demanded that these countries not trade with Russia, despite the fact that they need grain and fertilizer to like feed their people. Moreover, you also have this bill in the US Congress. It's the Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act. And this bill, I believe it's passed the House. I don't know or think it's gone through the Senate yet. But this bill would basically sanction African states and individuals if they do business with Russia, and it could possibly extend to China in the future. And it's a shocking bill in that it calls for the State Department to actually monitor the relationships between Russia and African countries and officials, and to basically punish those countries and officials who, as they say, are aiding Russia's malign influence and activities in the region. And then it also it doesn't even limit itself to African countries. It also demands that the State Department report on how Russia is manipulating African governments and their policies, as well as the public opinions and voting preferences of African populations and diaspora groups, including those in the US. So it's asking the US State Department to monitor the voting habits, perhaps, or whatever media that Black Americans are consuming. But I guess all this is to say that, on the one hand, you have the Americans warning about Russian and Chinese malign influence. And then on the other hand, you have this actual US malign influence. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
No, sure. I'm glad you raised it because, as we mentioned in the No Cold War briefing, I think it's it's an extremely paternalistic view of Africa, clearly, and clearly an expansion of a kind of Monroe Doctrine-esque thinking, where as they did in 1823, were saying, no, we're protecting Latin America from the imperialism of the West, but in fact, it was an opportunity to expand the U.S. empire and build the U.S. empire, and we kind of feel like there's this similar approach because, as you mentioned, with the specific act, the Democrat Gregory Meeks, who's the chair of the House of Foreign Affairs Committee, he basically said that the bill was, designed to thwart Putin's efforts to pilfer and manipulate and exploit resources in parts of Africa. And one is that we know very well that the US has their own pilfering, manipulation, and exploitation of resources. But apparently that's a more democratic form, it's a more democratic form because they come with these values. But in fact, as you said, the bill itself is a form of malignment and a manipulation of how they can better serve the US interests. And I mean, this was clear from that moment that there was not the sense of, Blinken is coming with Africa should choose, because Michael McCain, but he's one of the Republicans in the House of Foreign Affairs Committee. And he said publicly to the Congressional Committee that, and I'm quoting, we must make every state choose between doing business with the free world or with the war criminals. So, it's not a choice.
Wow.
This is they clearly are pushing this. And again, luckily, not luckily, because it's not super lucky since our African states are still a mess, is that a lot of African leaders and policymakers have spoken out against this. I mean, again, Naledi Pandor herself called it absolutely disgraceful, and other senior members of government have basically said that this is because the US was unhappy with how Africans voted. So this is actually a popular sentiment amongst government leaders in Africa, that this is a form of punishment for not siding. Because as you said, it was 17 African member states, they abstained, and a few others were absent, and Eritrea voted against. So it was about 25 who didn't go with the initial condemnation of Russia and Ukraine. And of course, they're not following that. Many more have abstained or, absented themselves from the proposed sanctions against the Ukraine, etc. So, I mean, I think the Africans are, in this moment, thankfully, there seems to be a mood of non-alignment where they're able to basically, through non-participation in these kinds of events, of being able to say, no, hold up, we don't want to be a part of this. But simultaneously, it's very concerning that we're kind of seeing a new phase of global NATO, and it's acting through AFRICOM, and AFRICOM has essentially been it was like the baby child of NATO and its senior commanders. So it is worrying that there is this expansionism that's happening with a specific, clear geopolitical motivation that will basically put us on the African continent in the crossfires.
I want to expand. I want to like elaborate on that a little bit. The things that you just mentioned. I want to get into AFRICOM, but first, you mentioned this sort of global Monroe Doctrine, and as is mentioned in the No Cold War briefing, uh, NATO officials have recently, more than one, has claimed Africa as what they call it, their southern neighborhood. Uh, so, yeah, which is compared in the briefing to the way that like the U.S. has called Latin America, either it's like front yard or backyard. Um, so, and this is kind of a part of that global Monroe Doctrine that you mentioned. Can you explain why European and NATO leaders are referring to Africa as their southern neighborhood, why it's significant, and why you're comparing this to a modern day Monroe Doctrine on a global scale?
Sure. I mean, first of all, of course, the wording itself indicates that by saying we're their southern neighborhood, it's this idea that they're the center of the world and the rest of the world is just kind of um, is proximate to the US agenda and the US worldview, right? So already that's kind of like patronizing. The other point that is important is that the outgoing AFRICOM leader, Stephen Townsend, he basically referred to Africa as NATO's southern flank. When we're saying southern flank, we clearly, there's, because a flank of what I understand military terms is a certain area where we have to protect ourselves. And so the way they position themselves as Africa is not like an independent partner who we would want to see them grow independent of our own agenda. It's that they're a strategic position for us to attack our enemies, and our enemies being China and Russia in the east. So with regards to then this global view of NATO, I think we've kind of seen, if I can actually let me back up a little bit,
Of
is
course.
that AFRICOM was established in 2007. And this, it was said, was in response, I quote, in response to our expanding partnerships and interest in Africa. And also, they also talked about James L. Jones, who was the Supreme Allied Commander of the NATO. He basically said that it was also due to the alarm that China has been causing by expanding its presence in the region. So from the start, AFRICOM is proposed as something to counter any kind of challenge to US global hegemony. That's one. Two is then AFRICOM, in the space of 15 years, which is, I think, a relatively short amount of time, is able to establish at least 29 military bases, permanent and semi-permanent military bases on the African continent, and has an extensive network of about like 60 outposts in 34 countries, which is over 60% of the nations on the continent. So it's placing itself on our land, on our territories, which is a breach of sovereignty, at least from us who come from the national liberation struggles, is a complete breach of that. That's one. Then two is that it's slowly doing this work with the partnership of NATO. So NATO is helping to do the military exercises like in early 2021, we had the African Lion training exercises with different African states and a few European states training in Morocco. And supposedly, again, it's for our own security, for our own, we have issues of extremist violence or whatever it is. But ultimately, this buildup seems to be happening at a time in which NATO is expanding or has just completed certain expansions in Eastern Europe. So Eastern Europe, I think it was 2004, right? When a bunch of Eastern European countries joined. 2007, we now see them moving down their southern flank. So it clearly, for us, and the bigger picture, looks like a kind of form of global expansion in the new era that is reminiscent of the Monroe Doctrine, because even though the public rhetoric is about security concerns, strengthening democracy, when you look at the US footprint, aside from the fact that it's like, in terms of quantity, is massive, the quality of it is also quite different, because where you find US military bases and interests, it often is in order to guarantee access to Africa's mineral resources, which is precisely what they said in the act that they want to kind of push back against with Russia, and specifically targeting the armed group, the Wagner group. But the US Army basically has a kind of commercial interest. And this, we, in our study, which we've spoken about before on US foreign military presence in the African continent, that we produced at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, this dates back also a couple of decades, where, when Dick Cheney was the vice president, he had documents like in 2018, it's called, I have it in my notes, Assessing and Strengthening the Manufacturing and Defense Industrial Base and Supply Chain Resilience of the United States, which, to shorten that, is basically to say, how can we use our national defense systems to secure certain commodities that are required in our country? And even as recently as February 2021, James L. Jones, who was the former AFRICOM leader, he basically spoke about how AFRICOM needs to be restructured and reconfigured so that state, commerce, energy, and defense can be a unified command. Sorry, I'm hitting my mic there.
No
Can be a
worries.
I get so handsy when I'm getting into these topics.
Understandable. There's a lot of like a passion here because this is like all outrageous, but please continue.
But I mean, essentially that, on the premise of trying to assist us on security questions, if you just look at a lot of the documentation, you'll see that there's a clear commercial interest, and that in fact the US military plays that kind of function of protecting the commodity supply chain and various commercial interests of the US, not exclusively, but predominantly. And of course, this is a red flag. How are you supposedly helping us to improve our nations when your defense force is essentially an armed security guard of the banks?
Right, exactly. I think what you mean to say is democracy. All of that was democracy. No, but it's an excellent point, and I do kind of want to get into like the comparison, which we've talked about before, between, you just described what the US is doing. I mean, that's wild that there's like 60 different outposts and access points in at least 34 countries. Like you mentioned, over 60% of the nations on the African continent when it comes to AFRICOM. And you explained that AFRICOM NATO relationship. But also this is, this is happening, when we're talking about this year specifically because of the war in Ukraine. You have all of these European countries increasing their defense budgets. And they're doing it under the guise of, well, Russia poses this huge security threat. So not only do we have to put more money into NATO, but we also have to spend more money expanding our own armed forces. When the Germans or the French talk about doing this, especially Germany, Germany is basically gearing up to become the world's, I think at this point, third largest military spender. All, under this whole, like, we have to fight the Russians guys. But it seems unlikely that the Germans or the French would really ever fight Russia. I don't think they even have that capability. And I don't think Russia is interested in a war with those countries. So I'm just curious, and this is pure speculation, but do you think this could lead to these, former colonial, currently neo-colonial countries getting more involved in Africa? We see the Germans playing a role in Mali, for example. And with this move to, militarize Europe, I guess my question is, what do you think that'll mean for Africa and really the rest of the developing world, given European history in these places, if they have bigger militaries?
Again, pure speculation. I can't say I've really thought this one too deeply, but the initial instinct would be two things. Is, in part, I doubt that a lot of major nations such as, or large economies on the African continent, such as South Africa, for example, I don't think South Africa would necessarily go along with it, because since the Trump administration, the relationship had been quite damaged. And of course, South Africa has a historical relationship with Russia for a variety of reasons, and the ANC with the Soviet Union. So I don't think places like South Africa would necessarily, unless we have like a dramatic change in the politics and the shift in the mood. But I don't see those groups necessarily. But there is, for example, with Germany, there is a possibility that, Germany could try to strengthen relationships with, like, for example, Nigeria, because Buhari, for those who don't know, AFRICOM doesn't have its headquarters in the African continent. It's in Stuttgart in Germany. And a couple of years ago, it was Buhari who had basically said, well, we can maybe host an AFRICOM base, right? And I think that that kind of sentiment might possibly foster kind of a German-Nigerian relationship. But again, it was South Africa who pushed back against that proposal. And I think the leadership of South Africa in this moment, as much as we have a lot of internal problems and we have our own issues with the government, they have been playing a leading role in holding a little bit of that non-alignment. And I think that as we saw with the United Nations General Assembly, the chair of the African Union, Macky Sall, who's the president of Senegal, he basically said, we don't have an interest in being involved in any kind of new Cold War. And, coming from a former French colony, I doubt that they would necessarily be this, acceptance of the French, especially because of what's happened in Mali and Burkina Faso and that kind of rejection. I think a lot of African nations, if we're really thinking smart about it, are going to leverage this moment to push for non-alignment. And basically to say, well, I'll take a little bit of this Germany, I'll take a little bit of this China. I see that right now as the mood. I can't say what will happen in the future, but there is suspicion towards former colonial countries or colonizing countries, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I mean, you do have also like the African Union has kind of pushed back a little bit in saying uh not getting on board. I mean, if you talk about South Africa playing a crucial role here, and I'm curious, in South Africa, I imagine like, the imperialists are always like 10 steps ahead, I feel like. And they recognize the countries where sentiments towards China or Russia might be more positive rather than negative. And I'm wondering if you're seeing any of that play out in the media in South Africa. Has because I've seen some reports about there's U.S. funded media in South Africa that's explicitly anti-China, pushing anti-China uh, rhetoric, and almost like a witch hunt against other outlets, calling them pro-China. How is this playing out in the media? And do you see an attempt by like the Western countries in the typical ways that they do to try to influence the perception through media?
Yeah, I mean, there are straight up, Ned funded National Endowment Fund type channels of funding the media. And of course, I think even despite the fact that many, really important media platforms, whether it's like the Mail and Guardian or any of the main like dailies, we are largely a kind of Eurocentricized society. And so a lot of our discourse is a reflection of, I think, Western dominant attitudes. Even how we see what we consider to be democratic is totally framed out of the kind of Eurocentric experience of so-called democracy. And so I think it's a little bit without necessarily, I can't necessarily mention specific examples, but I think there's a deeper embeddedness of Eurocentrism that guides how we see and view the rest of the world. And especially, I think, there's a deep sense of xenophobia, like like in general in South Africa, a deep suspicion and demonization of people who are coming from outside of South Africa, whether it's fellow Africans coming from Zimbabwe or Malawi. But because the society is so deeply fragmented across, deep inequalities, there is this constant suspicion of others because we have no social and economic stability. And so I think that kind of is more what underpins a lot of the sentiments, because we do have also some very good, like at the University of Johannesburg, there's a Center for China African Studies that has given really good, public interventions, and there are a few, but I think we largely get caught up in, as well as in national politics. So because we will be angry at Cyril Ramaphosa, if he does something with China, then of course it must be a bad thing, because we have such also a deep distrust about the general political landscape that's highly corrupt, highly kleptocratic, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
kleptocratic, oligarchical, etc. So I think we just treat others with suspicion
I
in
see.
general.
I see. And then, you explained the US role in Africa, I mean, pretty succinctly in the sense of you have the US using its military capacity to basically secure supply chains and cheap commodities and access to resources uh, cheaply for its own economy and for the economies of the global north.
Hmm.
How does China compare to that? How does China's relationship, and that's a really big question, but how would you say, I guess, in summary, does China's relationship compare to the US relationship? Because of course we're always hearing in the US media that China is an imperialist country that's going around the developing world and getting people getting countries to tricking them into these what are they called, debt trap diplomacy, these debt trap loans as like schemes to take over their industries and to take their resources. What is that China actually doing in Africa?
Sure. So, and I'm glad you raised this because this is also part of the US's existential fear about kind of losing its hegemonic position in the international economic system, is that Chinese private and public commercial interests have been steadily increasing over the last few decades. As I mentioned, we had like a record increase of over 35% in trade volume between 2020 and 2021. And Chinese firms have like consistently outbid most Western firms in various economic activities, whether it's in infrastructure, whether it's in telecoms, whether it's in transportation, energy, etc. But essentially, and I've said this many times before, it's often tough to talk about the whole continent because it's quite uneven, the different relationships. So, for example, we know that Angola is actually the majority of Chinese owed debt comes from Angola, which I think is close to a third, if I'm not mistaken. But the reason why Angola needed to do that is because they have also a very systematic and structural kleptocracy that's been happening since Isabel dos Santos was president, where she basically has huge stakes in the oil. Oil is their main mineral export or natural export. And through her she had a variety of companies that were basically all evading taxes. I
Mm,
think there was like close to 90 were in offshore companies. And so all of the kind of taxable revenues that could have been going back into the economy that would have allowed for Angola not to need so much foreign investment in order to build its own infrastructure and its own economy would have, you know, the money would have been there if the elites hadn't basically looted it through various forms of illicit financial practices.
mm,
So I'm raising that example because often what's missing from the conversation of debt and China is that China does not enter into the conversation having created the conditions in which we required so much
right.
foreign investment. And so from the structural adjustment of the 80s, from the various struggles to try to become economically independent, Africans ended up having, a lot of inherited debt. There's a form of debt which is considered, according to international law, not the fault of the country. And that usually is in the case of like colonial inherited debt and
Okay.
things like that. But there's a word for it that basically means when it's not your fault, it
Mhm.
should actually be written off. But that debt that we inherit from colonialism and neocolonialism was never written off. And so China comes to the African continent giving, low interest loans, giving loans that have a longer maturing period. So basically you can repay over a longer period of time. It comes with no conditionalities. And this is in an African continent where, we have a severe infrastructure shortfall of more than 100 billion annually would be needed to meet the infrastructural needs. That's just infrastructure. If we look at our energy sector, we also would need, I think, 300 billion in order to ensure that everyone had access to electricity by
Mhm.
2030, I think it is. And this is a continent where 55% of the people do not have access to electricity. So when China's coming with these possible projects that could build up our energy capacity, that could build up our infrastructural capacity, and aren't given conditionalities, are more feasible in terms of repayment, then Africans are going to take it on. And
Of
I've said
course.
this many times before. just having another option is already a form of us being better able to advance our own interests, because previously we were locked into, we just have to take the crumbs that the West is giving us, despite the fact that the West made their wealth off of centuries of exploiting our lands, our people, our resources. So I mean, relationships with China have been increasing on all fronts. And of course, I think that there's so much more that needs to be done by African leaders to better advance our own interests, because you often will see in these China-Africa exchange spaces, such as the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, it seems like China will bring something to the table and the Africans will sign it. But there's not this sense of pushing ourselves into the agenda, advancing our agenda. Even in the wording, it's a clearly Chinese written document, and you kind of are like, well, we literally could have just thrown in Ubuntu into the document, just even to superficially show some responsibility to the African people. But I think one interesting thing that I think is also maybe a showing of the difference between the relationship of China to Africa and the US to Africa, one of the many differences, is now with the G20 meeting in Bali, the African Union has for decades been pushing to be considered a member of the G20, and the US has kind of been quiet on the issue, whilst China has consistently said we support the African Union becoming a member. So even that, just creating political space and offering that political space is something that I think Africans appreciate and see as advantageous to the eventual kind of longer term objectives we have towards advancing our continent.
Right. In that sense, it's like in this sense, China's rise benefits the continent by basically providing it leverage in another partner it can rely on. And then also, giving Africa the ability to, you know, I guess, reach its potential as this kind of like independent economic bloc that could actually be powerful enough to reassert the global South in global politics. But of course, that I think it's important what you mentioned, because a lot of times when we talk about uneven deals, the way you described the sort of agreement sometimes between like the Chinese and some African country, it's like I can't remember who said it, but it's something about how like Africa doesn't have a China problem, it has a capitalism problem. And so yeah, when you have these like sort of kleptocratic capitalist elites making the deals, they're not going to do what's best for the country. They might do what's best that's going to line their pockets. And then maybe then you end up with deals that don't benefit a country as much as it could have, but that's not necessarily China's fault. And also I should mention, China did, and we talked to you about this on the freedom side a few months ago, China did forgive 23 interest-free loans for 17 African nations this year, which is something that is like unheard of when it comes to the IMF or the World Bank. That typically does not happen, let alone on interest-free loans. I don't think, do interest-free loans even exist for those financial institutions? I'm not sure. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But I guess, Mika, the last thing I would want to ask you here is, obviously China and Russia are very different countries, and their relationships to African countries are very different. And so I'm just curious how the Russian attitude or relationship, or I guess behavior on the African continent compares to, the United States. Obviously, it's much different than China. You don't really have like Russia making these really big trade deals or giving loans to African countries. But the US does like to point out Wagner Group and talk about Russia as being this really destructive force. And is that actually the case on the African continent, that Russia is a destructive force?
I mean, this one is more of a tough one. It's not the easiest one to answer in terms of China has a better track record in terms of the
Yeah.
more holistic approach that they've taken. But I would say in terms of scale, I think that the US has overinflated the scale at which Russia is existing and the presence on the continent. I mean, when it came to Burkina Faso and Mali, the reason there was in the Burkina Faso coup, you're seeing people coming out with Russian flags, is because their nation, and assisted by Western countries, was not able to curb the severe violence of the kind of jihadist extremist and insurgency groups, which, are occupying a third of that country. And so when they were private contractors were contracted to basically push back, and this was taking the form of some associated with the Wagner group, they saw that more successful operations were taking place. Whether or not that's, it's morally correct to contract mercenaries is a different question.
Right.
But people seem to see a difference in terms of the security question, and so that means something to the ordinary people. I mean, it's when ordinary people are waving a flag is a totally different thing from, a head of state waving the flag of a foreign nation. But in terms of the scale, I just think it's much much smaller in quantity and quality, and in terms of the way it's organized, it doesn't have that same, I think, homogeneity that the US does on the continent, where the US is coming in with a specific aim, even though it says it's not, and it operates. And again, I told you, in over 34 countries, we are having some form of US military presence and coordination. And it's often, again, surrounded or very close to specific commercial interests, whether it's, last year there was a visit to the DRC in a moment in which there was a new exploration of new mineral resources. And so the understanding amongst a lot of people now is that the US is coming in this many-pronged format, whether it's through its the Secretary of State, whether it's through the military, but it's a coordinated effort to secure its economic interests and its geopolitical interests, and not necessarily that of the African continent. And by the way, just as a small thing, as an ender, I mean, now with the meeting in Egypt on the COP27, I mean, we were reminded by the fact that this is the same US who, has evaded, since the Kyoto Protocol, has evaded having to account for the military's carbon emission footprint, which is one of the largest, I think it's the world's largest single institution emitter. And so if we're talking about, stability, security, climate, even if we're just looking at the climate question, their expansion into Africa between 2007 and now in terms of AFRICOM is a deep lack of concern or complete negation of the climate question, which has, as you know, disproportionately affected the global South and Africa. We've seen Kenya, Ethiopia going through severe weather changes with droughts. We've seen Mozambique, Tanzania, South Africa, parts of South Africa experiencing hurricanes and extreme cyclones that are flooding and causing huge havoc. And so for us, the kind of this military presence and the fact that AFRICOM is an expansion of NATO is part of this warmongering that has not only human lives that are being the cost of human life, but of the planet. And so it's disingenuous when in that document that was released that Blinken shared with us earlier in August on the US strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa, it's totally incongruous to say that you're going to assist Africa with climate adaptation and sustainability when you refused to remove your military presence. That would be the first step, is if you removed AFRICOM, that might help just a wee bit. So those are just some of the things that, I think we really are troubled by when it comes to the US treating Africa as its southern backyard.
Well, Mika, I want to thank you for joining me for the hour and breaking all this down. Can you remind people where they can follow your work and the work of your colleagues at the various places that you are producing excellent content at?
Yes, my main job, my day job, is at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, which you can follow us at the Tricontinental on Twitter, as well as check out our website and our Instagram. And then in terms of the kind of peace activism I'm involved in, we're a group called No Cold War, which is basically a platform for us where we're pushing for cooperation over conflict, for dialogue and peace over divisionism, as we've seen on the international stage. And you can also follow us on Twitter at No Cold War.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to see more progressive anti-imperialist content like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with the latest breakthrough news content. And if you want to support our work and get access to exclusive content, head over to patreon.com/breakthroughnews.